Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads. We've finally got another episode of Legends Book Club up for you all, and it's going to be another spooky episode here, another tie-in to October. We're releasing this around Halloween, so we wanted to read for you guys the prequel to Death Troopers. This is Red Harvest. If you're not familiar with Red Harvest, because let's be real, it's not one of the most popular Star Wars books. It came out in December 2010. It's written by Joe Schreiber as a prequel to Death Troopers, taking place all the way back in the Old Republic. And so nothing in the same timeline or vein of Death Troopers. But we're going to break down the characters, the plot, and give it a score in this latest episode of Legends Book Club. Before we do so, though, make sure you have liked the video. If you haven't, it really helps us out with the algorithm. Help us get to about 35 likes on this video. That would be our goal. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more great Star Wars content. This is one of our series we do. We do try to review a Legends book every single month to 6 weeks, so make sure you subscribe for all our latest reviews. If you want to join our Patreon, though, we do have extra Legends Book Club content over there, including live streams where we all discuss the book together, as well as a vote where you can pick the book yourself. So check out our Patreon and YouTube membership tiers and see if there is one that's right for you. All right, let's get into the book here. And as always, we'll start out with the plot and the writing of this story. Sanak, what were your thoughts on the way Joe Schreiber wrote this book, but also the overarching plot, how the whole thing went, the pacing, all of those good things?
I mean, I don't think the writing is that wonderful. It has the issue of trying to be an ensemble, like multiple POV story, but a lot of these characters are so disconnected, and usually that makes sense with dark side users, Sith, whatever, right? And the setting is a Sith Academy, which has so much potential, and I think they initially started off right. It's just then they started adding more and more and more. Then we get our good guys. Then we get some random characters that have dedicated chapters, but I would honestly call those interludes more than anything. And they kind of just disappeared too. So it just made me go I like that we got personality for all these guys. Don't get me wrong, but maybe there was just too many characters for this to really feel effective, to really feel the horror is mounting on our group in the same way Death Troopers had, right? Death Troopers had that family aspect. It had the Imperial groups and their differences, stuff that was identifiable, sure, but still generally a little less difficulty to follow. This was oh, that character from the very beginning is back at the very end, and you've already gone through 20 characters at that point that you're oh, that's them, an interesting time for them to return, right? So I struggled with that a bit. I still think that Schreiber chose a great setting. I mean, this is a awesome thing to really consider, being after KOTOR, before the Old Republic. It can be whatever. I wish that maybe this could have been the first book more so than Death Troopers, because I feel some parts of the writing felt like they were really trying to suddenly create and deviate some really interesting things with the whole zombie affect, the whole zombie virus. And there can be differences, sure, it is an older time period and whatnot. I just wish there's a little bit more oh, that feels very reminiscent of that scene with the Nightclone or whatever it used to be called, right? And Death Troopers. And here you're oh, it's a plant, right? And the funniest thing for me was that I found a lot of the writing around the plant to be some of the strongest stuff. It kept me a little bit more energized. I know people could definitely hate it, but I think there's just elements of the writing that just overall just couldn't really capture what the story could have really been. It was nice to get some great writing for some of the transformations, the horror moments, oh my god, that's happening. But the story didn't feel like it's really serviced, and the heroes of the story, when they're put in there, just feel like tag-ons more so than characters that are supposed to really put up a fight, put up a warning, do something, right? They're just there. So they're really up and down, plot, characters, all that, how it's arranged, but the moments that it needed to work, I still think there were some great elements there.
I agree. The plot here is simple, especially if you've read Death Troopers. It's two different settings. I appreciate that this setting is in the snow. There's Sith, there's Jedi. It's the origins of this whole thing. But Death Troopers being on a spaceship like the Nostromo and Alien, right? Like there's a lot more claustrophobic vibe. It builds to an exciting climax because there's no escape really, and every time you try to escape, it's suffocating in the way that the corridors and everything is tight, and the more and more zombies that exist, the less and less space you have to go. For Red Harvest, you've got this whole planet, right? And I think the snow is a cool visual to mess with, but we could have messed with it a bit more. In general, I found the pacing of this book still pretty good. You know what you're getting into if you're reading Death Troopers. It's a cheesy B-rate zombie horror story. And Schreiber does a great job with gruesome, really dark language. There's a lot of like kind of gory, disgusting things to read or listen to here. I did the audiobook of this again, just like I did last year with Death Troopers, and I do really love the production value behind the audiobooks of these stories. The pre-chapter reads of the chapters are very, very cool. There's a lot of haunting sound effects and ripping and gross sounds and screams, and a lot of that really adds to the atmosphere here that, you know, might not come across in the writing itself, but when you listen to audiobook, it really does. Now, the plot of this whole thing is not nearly as interesting as it could be. It's a little bit redundant too. And now let's get into really what I want to build on from that point is the characters, because the characters to me are the weakest part of the story. And we do have multiple characters to talk about here. I mean, there's almost too many characters in this story, but the main crux of the story focuses on the character of Darth Scabrous, who is searching for immortality, and that's why he needs this Murakami orchid to try to create this virus or toxin power to give himself new life. You also have Hestizo Trace, who is part of the Jedi Agricultural Corps, who is kind of connected to this black orchid and has to be with it in order for it to survive. You also have her brother, Rojo. Those are some of the standouts, as well as a whippet bounty hunter named Tulk. So, Sanak, let's talk about the characters. I kind of mentioned it, tying it into the plot. The plot is not something I necessarily had a problem with. It is simple, it's basic. But these characters, a lot of them are pretty one note.
Yeah, I think one note is the best way to describe it. I think it was interesting how they started because we follow the character of Nectar, I believe his name is, and they go up against someone else in a duel, and you're like, oh, that must mean that they're like a perspective. I was thinking reading it, I'm like, oh, will this be like the Sith Lord eventually at the end of the story? Like, will he disappear, be consumed? But we didn't, right? And that's the thing. Like, it was like a little bait and switch, and it was cool because I was like, all right, I'm in unexpected territory. Now I can really think about like all these other character interactions. Will they converge? Will they be like weightier, meatier? In a way they are, because, you know, zombies, meteor, sure, but in terms of like character development, arcs and growth, not really. And like you said, it is very much like a B movie. Like it's not supposed to be too much to think about, but it's hard to keep track of some of these guys, right? If they'd given us a few less, then maybe I would have like cared about some of them, ignore the others, been like, okay, they're the supporters, these are the stars, right? There are still some cool things, especially this being set in the Old Republic era. Scabrous has like an HK droid, and like the HK droid kind of being played off as like a protocol. Sir, I would never do that. Query? Like, how dare you assume that I would be some killing monster? And then there's a great scene where he becomes a true HK model droid, and I'm like, all right, that was really cool. The Jedi characters are hit or miss. Like Rojo had some weird entrance with some like Republic heavy stuff on Geonosis of all places, and then disappears for like a huge stretch of the book. I mean, it's not a long story, to be fair. It happens rather quickly, so these characters don't really have a lot of time to like grow. It's a lot more just like, this is who they are, react. And I understand that, but again, I just didn't care about it, right? I know Hestizo is like supposed to be our Jedi POV, and she had a great time with the plant that she listens to, like the voice of and all that, and like that's great. And that was honestly some of my favorite things because I found it so silly but just perfect for this writing. But even her, at moment, she would just be disappearing to characters that would be introduced in that chapter and then be done by that chapter, right? So, that's my problem with the character selection is that they had some great options. They just decided to be like, all right, well, we can make something nasty with this character that we saw for one line in like chapter 2 and make it happen in like chapter 23. And I'm like, that's okay, I guess. But it was just too much to keep track of. Like, there is a character that Nectar is fighting off, Lusk. He's at the end. And it's a great scene. It's like a very, like, oh, shock horror moment, right? And that would probably play out really well as a jump scare if I could see it. In the audiobook, it kind of all got tangled up, right? So that was my one issue. Just too many to keep, and the ones that are supposed to be our stars don't really get their due. It's cheesy. Maybe I shouldn't be really complaining about horror book characters. I was just hoping them to be a little bit closer to like Death Trooper quality.
That's a fair point. That it is horror, and like I mentioned with the plot, right? You know what you're getting into. It's hard to really go after this book and be like, this is terrible, because it's horror. It's going for simple horror story. Now, it doesn't add too much to the mythology of Star Wars, and I think that's where some people probably get down on this book. And it let's be frank, it's written very gruesomely. Like, not just anybody can pick up this book, and Star Wars has always been a little bit more, even the adult novels, a little bit more accessible to all ages. But when it comes to character here, there's nobody who I left this book going, I will completely remember them forever. I like the name Darth Scabrous, but Darth Scabrous is pretty one note in what he wants. I did think it was cool the way he goes about it. There are some really, really dark images with him, with sacrifice, the Sith sword, all this stuff that does beg a question about a certain group of the Sith. Is there this kind of more cultish, more witch-like, it's like satanic side of the group of the Sith? Stand out, sure, but not somebody necessarily that I think thematically is rich. Estizo was somebody I was more disappointed with, because Estizo doesn't really grow as much as I'd hoped she would. She is the main character of the story, and for the most part, she's a lot of being trapped or running away from things. The one character I did really like was Tulk, and I thought he actually grew. He had a starting point. He's working for money. It's a pretty standard Star Wars arc. He's working for money, doesn't care about what happens to other people. Then he's forced into this survival situation with this Estizo, and he learns to grow and care about other people instead of just himself, right? Those are the types of things we're dealing with, but there are a handful of characters that once you get about 5-6 chapters into the story, you realize, okay, these characters are cannon fodder. And so there wasn't much to it. And then Rojo Trace, I think, was the one I was kind of most disappointed in, because that character starts out so strongly in the beginning, but then has a line that's completely ripped off from Taken, the movie with Liam Neeson. And the most famous line in that film, by the way. And then he doesn't really appear until the third act of the book. So there are just things and inconsistencies with these characters. There's a lack of progression and arcs that something like Death Troopers still even had, like Trig and Kale Longo, are characters that grow, and you learn about their backstory, as well as the Doctor from that novel. They're characters with a dark side, and you get to learn these layers and peel back layers of kind of an unexpected amount of depth for those characters in Death Troopers, and when things happen to them, you really do care about it. But here, it's more interested in the plot. How does this happen, and how do we make Jedi versus zombies or Sith versus zombies as scary and gruesome as possible? Let's give our final scores here for Red Harvest. Sanak, what were your final thoughts, your wrap up here, and your score out of 5?
I think this is a great book to read if you're trying to get into like a little bit more of the campy, cheesy vibes of Halloween, the spooky season, right? It's definitely not something I'd be like, oh, like your kid read this. No, but if you're like a teenager who's really like diving into like horror, and you're like, I like the horror that kind of just makes me laugh, this is, something that's a pretty good fit, because you'll still get some great horror, gruesome zombie undead moments. You'll get some great visual descriptions. It just happens to be that like a lot of like the character work, a lot of the plot is kind of just thrown in between some of the more like standout kills in a way that is a bit disappointing, because the setting, the characters, the creatures even of this era, you can really flesh out into like a very unique pattern, a very unique story. And the fact that we are following purely like dark side acolytes being trained at academy in the snow, you can have a little bit more of the feeling like we're locked in here and like there's nothing we can do but to like survive, right? It could be something more like akin to like The Thing or something, where you don't even know who's really turning into the zombie until like the moment springs. And there are moments where it kind of hints at something like that. There are elements of this book that I think are really fun to really chew on, but it's only a couple of seconds here and there before you move on to the next chapter. You're like, okay, I don't remember this character. Is this a new character? Is it an old character? But yeah, if you want to read this, definitely do, maybe just in this month or whenever you're like on a big horror binge. If you've read Death Troopers, definitely read this, because at least there's some understanding of like, oh, this stuff not only was there in the past, but it's like a mini origin of sorts, own like creepy, crazy variation to it. So if you're looking for something that is similar to that book, but isn't like just like, oh, it just happened 4,000 years earlier and it's just older characters, yeah, it's a great for picking that up. But I think I'll leave my score here like a 2.75. I'm a little disappointed. I really did enjoy Debt Troopers and what it left me with. After reading this, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, for me, I have a lot of similar thoughts. I think the thing that is very underwhelming about this book are the characters. There are some cool designs, some cool ideas in the plot, but ultimately I prefer Death Troopers characters so much more, even with Han Solo and Chewbacca being randomly a part of that story. I thought about those characters way more. There was a lot more interest in those characters when things happen to them, or bad things happen to them, or things almost happen to them, even though that story is much more similar to things we've seen before or read before than Red Harvest is. I think almost everything about Death Troopers is superior, and we still have to kind of compare them because that one came out first. This is part of kind of a duology. They're both written by the same person, intended to be the same story. So therefore, I think I will have to give this book about a 2.5 out of 5. It's average across the board. Again, if you like horror, Star Wars, you're going to enjoy this. I did enjoy my time with this novel. There's just nothing here that's going to carry over. When I think about Star Wars horror, I will much more go back to Death Troopers than I ever really will in Red Harvest, especially in a time period like the Old Republic that's so rich with Star Wars storytelling. This feels just kind of the forgotten story of that time period. Nothing really builds on each other. Nothing really matters for the future. So thank you so much for watching our review of Red Harvest. Legends Book Club will be back with a bang here in the future. We are going to get into a lot more stories. And again, you can join our Patreon if you'd like to have some discussions with us directly about these novels. You can get that in one of our tiers. You can also help choose which novel or comic book you'd like to see us read for Legends Book Club if you subscribe to our Patreon or YouTube membership tiers. Check out that program over there. Make sure you like the video if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel for more. Check out the Star Wars Lads Halloween Special 3. That is up on the channel now. Check it out. It's a lot of fun. Hopefully you enjoy that. Happy Halloween, everyone, and we will see you next time.